Hello. Welcome to Sewing Seams with Deb. When today I'm going to talk about my top 5. So another part in the top 5 series, and this time I'm talking about my most used sewing tools. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're well, and thanks for coming by to have a gas bag about my most used sewing tools, my top 5 series. So the first one I want to talk about is the tape measure, the humble old tape measure. Now, where would we be without our tape measure? And how many have you got? I've got heaps of them. I've got this retractable type. I've got this one situated in the cutting room, one cutting on the cutting table, one near the ironing board, 2 in the knitting bags. I've got heaps of them. So just, I think we need to remember that if we've got the plastic ones, and I think this is a plastic one, they can stretch. So you need to double check that they are still accurate from time to time, and you may need to buy a new one. So I'm just checking against another brand new tape measure, and yes, it's accurate still. So you know when you measure literally from this metal piece to the edge of something, so sometimes that you just got to watch that might grow on you, and then it becomes inaccurate. So first one, the old tape measure. Just in line with the tape measure, I always keep handy a really little ruler. This one's got inches and centimeters, and it's just a little 6-inch ruler, 6-inch ruler, and it's very handy for little tasks. That sits not far from my sewing machine, so it's being part of the tape measure. The other thing that a lot of you have is this gauge, and this is really handy. I've got a couple of these. This is really good, particularly for things like if you are measuring the bottom of a hem or the edge, from the edge of something to a certain direction. So you can move this dial up and down. So, and then all you got to do is measure it go along to the edge. So say you want to make sure the edge of the pattern is the same all the way along. So you just measure from the edge to that red dial and all the way along. So then you know it's accurate. So this is really handy. This is on hand just about every time I sew. But I'm putting it under the heading of tape measure or measuring. So we've got to measure accurately. So measure twice, cut once. Very important. The next thing of my most used sewing tools is my pins. Again, I've got little pin cushions, lots of them all over the place. And I've got a variety of pins. These pins are very good for delicate fabrics. They've got an extra sharp ball point on the end. They're good for knits as well. So they are beautiful glass head pins that don't melt if you happen to put them, if they happen to be in the way when you're pressing something with the iron. So they're my favorite pins. I've got other pins. One moment, please. I've got these ones. And this pin cushion, I've had this from the Day Dot, from back in the day. So it's actually getting a little bit munted, a bit yucky inside there, but I like to still use it because it reminds me of the days gone by and all that sewing I've done. These pins are bigger, they're longer and stronger, so they're good for the heavier weight fabrics. They're certainly good for denim, and a lot of you know that I do work with denim a fair bit and upcycling and so on. They are actually known as quilters pins, I believe. Well, certainly on the packet. So pins, very good. Now, these ones here, I don't use them very often. They're ballpoint pins. I'll just open them and show you one or two of them. The heads are very fine. Can you see those? They're very, very fine and small head pins. They're really, really good for very, very delicate fabrics. So these are the true ballpoint pins. And then I also have these pins. There's another name for these, and I don't know the name of them. But I use them for blocking my knitting projects when I block them, and there's a whole process for that. They're special pins that have got a double head on them, and they've got a bend as well. If you can see the bend, can you see that? So you prong them into the garment and hold it down, especially for lace knitting projects. So yeah, I don't use them that often, but I do use them. So pins. This next tool is probably one of the most used tools in my sewing room, and that's the snips. So, you know, very different than scissors. They're very good for just snipping the threads and trimming away a seam edge, not unlike the duckbill scissors. And if you've just got small area to trim, they're very good for things that I've noticed they're good for things like bag making, when you've got to trim really awkward places to get to. So now the burning question, and I always have a burning question, do I have enough snips? I've got a few, and they're strategically placed, and I can look like Edward Scissorhands with all these snips. So snips, my favourite ones are the blue ones. Now we come to the very all-important tweezers. Now these tweezers are very, very good when your eyesight's starting to fail you a little bit, and you need to thread the machine by hand, particularly for the overlocker. I'm looking over there because it's where mine lives. And yes, you might get the thread close to the eye of the needle, but then to be able to grab it and just pull it through and to guide it through. So these special overlocker tweezers are really, really helpful and useful for that, and I use them with my sewing machine as well, especially my older sewing machine that doesn't have an automatic threader. So just grab the thread and pull it through. So really, really handy and most used in my sewing room. Not the only things, I must say. These aren't the only things I use, but I really reach for them all the time. So I have them on hand, ready to use. So when I set my machine and my table up for the work day or whatever, my workstation, I always have these included with the other tools. Last but not least, we have the all-important quick unpick, also known as a seam ripper. Now, I have a bit of information about the seam ripper and a bit of background on the history. So just hang with me for a sec. So a seam ripper is a small sewing tool used for cutting and removing stitches. The head is usually forked with a cutting surface as the base of the fork. In some designs, one side of the fork tapers to a sharp point to allow easier insertion in tighter areas. In using a seam ripper, the sharp point of the tool is inserted into the seam underneath and the thread to be cut. The thread is allowed to slip down into the fork and the tool is then lifted upwards, allowing the blade to rip through the thread. Once the seam has been undone in this way, the loose ends can be removed and the seam re-sewn. So great for unpicking seams. How many times we unpick our seams every time we make a project? Basically every day. So I thought you might be interested in the history of the seam ripper. One moment, please. So the seam ripper was probably invented sometime in the late 1800s, and one of the earliest patents for a similar tool was a thimble that had an addition of a small knife that was patented in the United States by W. Miller in 1883. That was used to rip threads in a similar way to the seam ripper, while a later patent exists for the tool. So we've got the same patent for the tool. Tip. Here's a tip for you, and it's about the tip. See that red tip there? If you put it in the seam this way, it won't continually rip and rip a hole in your fabric. If you go to unpick this way and you slip, you'll rip a hole in your fabric. You've got more control this way, that way with the red dot underneath or whatever colour, than you do with the long piece underneath. Just a bit of trivia for you. A bit more trivia for you about the seam ripper. With extended use over time, the blade can get dull at the point and it becomes useless. And that's happened to me because I've overused it that much. If you've got an attachment to that particular seam ripper or quick unpick, or you don't want to buy a new one or you can't, then you can sharpen it. And there's a special tool for that, but you can use steel wool and sharpen it yourself. So just slide it up and down and floss it through that the cutter part in the middle. So a bit of steel wool will fix that for you. And Bob's your uncle. You know Uncle Bob? Bob's your uncle. So there's my top 5 most used sewing tools. Thanks so much for joining me for another top 5 in the top 5 series. And until I see you again, take good care of yourself, stay well, and happy sewing. Bye.